happiness and pleasure can be equated, whether they mean the same thing. Thank you for coming.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and I would like to apologize for being a bit late this evening, but I am just coming from a 2-hour lecture at the Gozo Center of the University of Malta, so this would be probably my last part of the day. Hopefully finding a good supper which will crown the day. Right. The title of this evening's lecture is The Philosophy of Happiness. Now, some might say happiness, isn't it an awkward word to use today in this day and age of warfare, conflict, tensions, atrocities which we hear about? And this might seem to be the answer to this title, but I think that the idea of happiness, the concept of happiness, the notion of happiness, has been with us since time immemorial. So in every epoch, in every historical era, happiness has been dealt with. The idea of happiness, what happiness is all about, what it should mean, has been present all throughout man's history. And therefore, I think it is no surprise that in the face of all the negative aspects which we are all the time listening, I think that we should be a bit positive and try to think and discuss this topic. The idea of happiness has its roots in Greek philosophy, and this might not come as a surprise. In fact, we can say that since the earliest days of Western thought, philosophers have concerned themselves with the nature of happiness. Another thing which I would like to say at the beginning of this lecture is that today, obviously, not only philosophy is interested in happiness, but other sciences. For example, psychology. And today, in fact, we speak of the science of happiness. Psychologists taking up this idea of happiness with a certain interest and conviction, because certain psychologists are, in a way, tired of hearing all the time about pathology, about illnesses, and they want to be a bit more positive. In fact, there is a school of psychology which is known as positive psychology, which is not completely new. One may think of the humanistic school of psychology. Rogers, May, Maslow, who in a way were the forerunners of today's positive psychology. Obviously, this evening we are going to deal with the subject from a philosophical point of view, because obviously this is a philosophical society. So, with all due respect to psychology, which I teach also, we have to stick to our guns and try to deal with the subject, therefore, from the philosophical standpoint. The first person to speak about happiness was Socrates. Socrates, the father of ethics, the philosopher who changed the route and the direction of philosophy from an interest in cosmology to an interest in anthropology, therefore wanted to read within human nature. He was interested in knowing what human nature is all about. Obviously, we have to understand Socrates' standpoint and what he said about, amongst others, the concept of happiness in the context of the historical epoch in which Socrates lived. As you know, Socrates lived when Greece was made up of a number of city-states, the polis. He was an Athenian, therefore he lived in Athens. He had lived through the Peloponnesian Wars with Sparta. He had actually taken part as a foot soldier in the Athenian army, and therefore he also had his share of ill adventure or misadventure, and obviously he saw his beloved Athens eventually lose the last war at the hands of Sparta in the beginning of the 5th century BC. Now, Socrates believed that happiness is not something which comes from outside. During this period, the common idea was that happiness is something which is a God-given gift. It is the gods which give you happiness, so it does not depend on your will, does not depend on your intelligence, etc., but it is something which the gods decide to give according to their whims and fancies. Or else, happiness might be the result of luck, the result of hubris, as the Greeks call it. Now, Socrates was convinced that happiness can actually come from within the person. It is man himself who is the originator of happiness. Obviously, we have to see what kind of happiness Socrates meant. And in this sense, therefore, he said that rational control, Socrates, especially as we know him through Plato, as you know, the first dialogues, the dialogues of Plato are divided into 3 parts. So the early dialogues, the middle dialogues, and the late dialogues. The early dialogues, today all scholars agree that Plato is actually showing what Socrates believed. Socrates speaks through Plato, if you want. The middle and the late dialogues, as you know, are much different because it is the thought, the mature thought of Plato, because obviously even Plato eventually matured in his philosophical journey. Now, Socrates believed very much, obviously, in man's rational powers, in reason. And therefore, he believed that we are truly human beings, we can truly be happy when we act according to our nature, which is of a rational aspect. Therefore, man can be happy, man can gain happiness if he acts according to his nature, which is, as we said, a rational nature. Now, this kind of control over what? Obviously, the control of reason on the emotions, on the spirited part of man, and on the instinctive or the appetitive part, the instincts. And obviously, this is also what Plato will show us, even especially in the Republic, when he speaks about the ideal state. Now, Socrates therefore believed that man can actually be happy if he gains control, rational control, over the other parts of his person. Okay? The body with its appetites and with its spirited part. Doing so, Socrates believed, produces a kind of divine-like state. Man almost becomes divine. Why? Because Plato, who was a believer, Plato believed in the gods. Okay? There was no atheist. One of the 2 false accusations which actually were brought against Socrates was religious impiety. together with the corruption of youth. And what was this religious impiety all about? Simply, Socrates did not accept the way in which the gods were represented, especially in certain myths. He was so religious that he did not accept that the gods be vilified or be shown as being immoral, as was usually the case in the various myths in which the gods were involved. So, not only was Socrates not irreligious, but he was very religious. And therefore, he believed that man can, in a way, become godlike. He can become godlike precisely because through his control, through his nature, he can obtain that kind of tranquility which, in a way, is of the gods. So, even man in his imperfection, even man in his troubles, can achieve this happiness if only he gives consent to this control of the reason over the body. So, Socrates, as we know, is represented in a number of dialogues which Plato wrote. Now, three important dialogues which deal with the theme of happiness are the Euthydemus, the Symposium, and the Republic. Let's try to see what Socrates had to say in these three dialogues regarding happiness. The Euthydemus can be considered the first piece of philosophy in the West to discuss the concept of happiness. But its importance is not merely historical. Why? Because in this dialogue, Socrates mentions two very important points. First, Socrates believed that happiness is what all people want. Everyone wants to be happy. No one wants to be sad. I mean, everyone is in his or her normal stance, okay? I mean, no one seeks to be sad. We seek to be happy. Obviously, the question is, what constitutes happiness? And this is the question which Socrates tries to answer. Since happiness is always the end, that is, the goal of our activities, therefore, Socrates believed that it is an unconditional goal. Other goals might be in-betweens. They are conditional and conditioned. Happiness is this unconditional goal because it is what all persons, what all men and women, obviously, want to attain. We speak of the pursuit of happiness. We want to reach happiness. We want to be happy. But how do we go about it? And therefore, Socrates says happiness does not depend on external things, as many people unfortunately think. Many people think happiness is obtainable through external things. Being rich, being honored, having your whims and fancies satisfied, okay? So wealth, health, pleasure, these are what many people usually understand by happiness. Happiness, therefore, for them is something external. For Socrates, happiness is something internal. So happiness does not depend on what you have, but on what you are. This reminds me of the book by Erich Fromm, Essere o Avere, to be or to have. Unfortunately, many people are all the time thinking on what they have and what they want to have and what they can have, etc. So they put their happiness on external things, and therefore this is many times why people seem never to be happy. They think that they can obtain happiness by putting their trust and all their activities in external things to end up with being unhappy. So therefore, what does this show? It shows, therefore, that happiness is not dependent on external things. In the symposium, the second dialogue in which the theme of happiness is taken up, we have this dialogue which, as you know, takes place at a dinner party, and the topic of happiness is raised when each of the partygoers, when each of the participants takes a turn to deliver a speech in honor of Eros, the god of love and desire. Eros, as you know, was the son of Aphrodite, and he is considered to be the god of love and desire. And to interlocutors in this dialogue, namely Eryximachus, who was a doctor, and Aristophanes, the famous playwright, express their views about what they think happiness is all about. Eryximachus, the doctor, claims that this god, Eros, above all others, is capable of bringing us happiness, because he instills in us the desire to love, to be loved, and therefore, according to Eryximachus, Eros is capable of producing happiness in the person. Aristophanes, on the other hand, agrees, claiming that Eros is that helper of mankind who eliminates those evils whose cure brings the greatest happiness to the human race. So, Aristophanes believed that, yes, Eros is capable of bringing happiness because he can eliminate those evils. Now here we have the idea, therefore, that happiness is the lack of pain. Now, as you know, the theme of pleasure and pain is found in Greek philosophy, especially then in post-Aristotelian philosophy, especially with the Epicureans, because it was thought that happiness and desire are equal, are identical. However, Socrates intervenes, and he tries to bring these two friends to their senses, if you want. Okay? And he tries to show that, yes, it seems that Eros is capable of bringing this happiness about, but let us not forget, Socrates tells them, that there is also a darker side to Eros, who is the representation of desire. It is he who instills in us this desire. And why, therefore, is there this darker side? Because according to Socrates, Eros is constantly longing, bringing in us the desire, which desire is never satisfied. So he instills in us desires, but many times these desires are not satisfied. So Socrates concludes it cannot be that the god Eros, in this case, is capable of putting permanent, long-lasting happiness in the heart and mind of human beings. The third dialogue, The Republic, which is, as you know, considered to be Plato's masterpiece, he, that is Socrates, wants to prove that the just person is happier than the unjust person. You know that the main theme of the Republic is the concept of justice. What did Socrates and Plato mean by justice? Justice for Socrates and Plato meant that the person is capable of reaching a state in which he is in control, as we said, of all his faculties and powers. He is capable to go through life with a certain sense even of optimism, of joy, and therefore it is only the life of the just which is capable of producing happiness. The unjust person can never be happy. He might show happiness because he is rich, because he is being honored, because he has all the pleasures of this world at his feet, but in actual fact, it is a false happiness, the famous akrasia. Okay? The element of, how can we call it? Misjudgment, if you want. The element of missing the point, missing the goal. And this is basically what the term akrasia meant for the Greeks. You are not what you should be. Okay? You are trying to find happiness in something which cannot give you happiness, because you are basing your happiness on false premises, and therefore you are doomed to therefore never be happy, or else feign happiness, but in your heart you know that you are actually not happy at all. And this is, as you know, something which exists. Right. So Socrates says, since all men naturally desire happiness, this is what we said, we all want to be happy, then the conclusion comes automatically. We, therefore, if we want to be happy, we have to live a just life. In the process of making this argument, Socrates makes many other points regarding what happiness is, and this is a point which we have mentioned, the relationship between pleasure and happiness. Okay? Is happiness tantamount to pleasure? Happiness equals pleasure? Or is there something else? And also the relationship between pleasure, happiness, and virtue. And obviously here the aspect of morality comes in. As I said, Socrates is considered to be the father of ethics. And it was he who, we said, shifted the attention of philosophy from cosmology to anthropology. Man, for Socrates, becomes the focus of all philosophical inquiry and philosophical investigation. Therefore, man is the creature who can go inside himself through introspection and find the real roots and origins of happiness. How? By living an ethically moral life, an ethically just life. For Socrates, as well as for Plato, this is what constitutes true happiness. Happiness which, since it does not depend on external factors, can be true and long-lasting, not fleeting happiness, as happens, therefore, in the situation where one puts all his weight in external objects. Now, Socrates presents a number of arguments. So the first argument is the analogy between health in the body and justice in the soul. He says, look, what does a healthy body is constituted of? What makes a healthy body? A healthy body is a body which has all its parts, all its organs functioning. They are, interconnected, if you want. They are acting according to the function, and therefore that would be a healthy body. On the same lines, we can speak of a healthy soul. What is a healthy soul? A healthy soul, for Socrates and for Plato, is when the person has control of the other parts of the soul. According to Plato, as you know, the soul, the human soul, is a tripartite soul. That is, a soul made up of three parts. The rational part, the appetitive, the spirited part, and the appetitive part. Now, justice in a person is just, according to Socrates and Plato, when the rational part is controlling the other two parts. And in fact, this idea, here we are therefore in Plato's psychology, this idea, this notion of the tripartite soul, is then reflected in Plato's ideal state. Plato's ideal state, the state which is made up of the three sections, the philosopher kings and the philosopher queens, the guardians and the workers, is what? Is the person but enlarged. So we have the person with the tripartite soul enlarged, okay, to the extent of a community, of a society, and what is happening and what should be happening in the particular person is reflected in society. So society, in a way, is a reflection of the individual. Socrates wants to show that living a virtuous life brings greater pleasure than living an unvirtuous life. And he wants to show further that the higher pleasures of the just life are not merely peace of mind, that is, yes, one of the fruits, if you want, of a happy life, but also, and Socrates therefore here now introduces a very important idea, the pleasure of seeking knowledge. The pleasure of seeking knowledge. The pleasure, the pursuit of knowledge, according to Socrates, produces an almost godlike state in the human being, which we mentioned a few minutes ago. Therefore, these are pleasures which the human person is capable of cultivating. Pleasures which do not depend on external things, but which are, in a way, the product of rational activity. And obviously, it comes as no surprise to read in the Republic that according to Socrates, or according to Plato, using Socrates, who is at the pinnacle of this pursuit? It is the philosopher. The philosopher is at the pinnacle of this pursuit. Why? Because the philosopher is the person who, fortunately enough, manages to remove the blinkers which did not allow him to see reality and face reality for the first time. Obviously, this immediately brings to mind the parable of the cave, which we find in the Republic, because it is the philosopher who is able to contemplate the good, the idea, the notion, or the form of the good. This experience is an experience which by far exceeds what any physical pleasure can bring about. The third argument which Socrates brings about is perhaps the most powerful argument, and the one which Socrates actually dedicates to Zeus, which is the so-called principle of the relativity of pleasure. We find different pleasures, but not all pleasures are of the same kind, are of the same depth, are of the same satisfaction. So pleasures are relative. One pleasure can be more pleasurable than other. One pleasure can be less pleasurable than other, or than others. Okay? So there is a kind of ladder, there is a kind of scale in the very idea of pleasures. And in fact, this is what Socrates says. Most pleasures are not really pleasures at all, but merely result from the absence of pain. If I am in pain and I am prescribed some kind of medicinal, and that medicinal removes my pain, okay, that makes me happy. But is happiness only the removal of pain, or is it something much more deep? And therefore, Socrates says that pleasures are different. The most important pleasures are those which produce real and long-lasting happiness. And in this sense, yes, we can say that therefore pleasure and happiness are the same, but only if we understand what Socrates and Plato are actually understanding by pleasure. Spiritual, in the widest sense of the word, obviously, pleasures which are the result of our rational nature. Man is capable of entertaining these pleasures which allow us to grow, to develop, to realize and actualize our potentials, and therefore it is those pleasures which man should actually seek. Unfortunately, obviously, this is not always the case, as we said, because we are in a way bound many times by material goods, and it is those which many times are the focus of our attention. We can go on dealing with various philosophers. I wanted rather to focus a bit on Socrates, because I think what Socrates says will influence all later philosophy. Plato, Aristotle, as you know, will emphasize a virtuous life, the importance of the virtues. Aristotle, as you know, was more pragmatic than Plato. Plato was the idealist. Okay? And notwithstanding this, Aristotle, just the same, saw that happiness is not what material pleasures, external pleasures can offer, but it is based on living a virtuous life. The virtues, the moral virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, those virtues are at the basis of a moral or ethical upright life. I have to hurry because time is running out. If we go a bit to the medievals, especially Augustine and Aquinas, we obviously have, in a way, I wanted to mention the Epicureans and Plotinus, but I do not have the time, the necessary time. But okay, with the medievals, obviously, the attention obviously now is focused on God. God is the center of our happiness. Augustine is important not only because he ushers in the medieval period in the history of philosophy, but also because he is the first philosopher to give due importance to emotions, especially to love. We all know the famous phrase of Augustine, love and do what you will. For Augustine, love obviously was not erotic love or just physical love, even if he experienced that kind of love himself in his youthful days, but it is first and foremost the love of God, which ushers in a new way of looking at life and which allows us to love others, because we cannot love others if we do not experience the love of God. With Aquinas, in the 13th century, we also have something similar. For Aquinas, it is only God who can give us true and everlasting happiness. So much so that Aquinas then obviously speaks about the visio beatifica, which we will experience when we will come face to face with God in the other world. Coming to the modern period, we have Pascal, who speaks about happiness. Okay? For Pascal, being influenced by Plato, he sees the moral life as being important. It is that which produces happiness. If we speak about Kierkegaard, now we are approaching our own age. Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, made also emphasis on the importance of love, on the importance of going through a number of stages. Okay? Kierkegaard speaks of 3 stages: the aesthetic stage, the ethical stage, and the religious stage. It is through those 3 stages that we can enjoy happiness, that we can experience happiness, and the religious experience, as you know, for Kierkegaard is fundamental. The famous leap of faith. Kierkegaard believed that faith is something which one has to experience on a personal level. It is not what the institution, the church, or any other institution tells us, but it is only when one makes a true personal experience of God that therefore that experience will bring happiness. Goethe, he is one of the philosophers and writers, okay, who exerted influence on a number of German philosophers. For Goethe, okay, in his famous Dr. Faust, his most famous piece of writing, tells us that happiness is the result of human liberty. It is only when one enjoys full human liberty that one can experience true happiness. And we know that the period in which Goethe was living was the aftermath, if you want, of the French Revolution, with the famous slogan of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So freedom, being free, being able to exert one's freedom is fundamental for happiness. So this historical, if you want, excursus of the way in which philosophy has dealt with happiness shows that, as we said at the beginning, happiness has always been at the center of philosophical investigation. Why? Because it is something which we all long for. And as I said at the beginning, more and more perhaps in this day and age, when everything seems bleak, when everything seems negative, when pessimism seems to be the rule of the day, and therefore perhaps looking at what the Western, at least the Western tradition, but obviously I'm not excluding the Eastern tradition, okay? But looking at what the Western tradition has told us about this idea, this notion of happiness, may perhaps instill in us hope for the future. Not everything is as bleak as it might seem at first sight, and therefore it is something which I think will never cease to exist. Man will always continue to pursue happiness, as each and every one of us perhaps understands happiness, but there is this common denominator which makes us all feel the importance of happiness. We all want to be happy. And I think that in this sense, Western philosophy has important things to teach us about this notion. Thank you very much.